Now, on the news that the lawyer for Ian Brady has said he doesn't believe the serial killer knew where one of his victims was buried. Brady, along with his partner Myra Hindley, kidnapped, tortured and murdered 5 children in the 1960s before burying their bodies on Saddleworth Moor. But the remains of one of their victims, 12-year-old Keith Bennett, have never been found.
I think so far as trying to locate Keith Bennett's body, whatever he knew about the situation and the possible location would have been sorted out in the 1980s. I do feel very, very sorry for the family, and indeed I've had situations where I've been on the other side in a similar situation to relatives of victims whose bodies haven't been found, and the anguish is considerable, but that doesn't mean that in this particular case he had the answer.
Well, our North of England correspondent Becky Johnson joining us now live from Ashworth High Security Hospital on Merseyside, where Brady had been held since 1985. Hello to you, Becky. Good to talk to you. Interesting, I was talking to my son about Ian Brady today, and he is of a generation where he didn't really remember him. I'm of a generation where his name sent a chill down the spine of every parent.
Yeah, he's been described by many today as wicked, and we know that far from having any remorse for his crimes, he revelled in his notoriety. I think one of the things that led to his branding, continuous branding as one of the most evil criminals of a generation, was the torment that he put Winnie Johnson through. Now, she was the mother of Keith Bennett, one of Brady's young victims, the only victim whose remains were never found on Saddleworth Moor. And Winnie Johnson, up until her death in 2012, used to beg Brady to reveal details so that she could have some closure, so that she could have a funeral for her son, and yet he never did disclose the location of that burial site on Saddleworth Moor. And we've seen today tributes being left on Saddleworth Moor. We know that Winnie Johnson herself used to take tributes up there to her son. Her whole life became about campaigning to try to find his whereabouts. Greater Manchester Police have said that they will never close this case. They said barely a week goes by without them getting some form of information, somebody trying to help to lead them to the remains, but as yet still not discovered. But Greater Manchester Police saying that Brady's death will not mean the closure of this case. They will continue to investigate. This is where Brady died yesterday evening. We'd last seen him in public in 2013. He appeared at a mental health tribunal. He'd been on hunger strike here. This is a secure hospital. He wanted to be transferred to prison so that effectively he could be allowed to die, because here he was fed through a tube. And while he was giving evidence at that mental health tribunal, we got a real insight into his character. He was extremely rambling, as I say. He showed absolutely no remorse, didn't seem to grasp even the seriousness of his crimes. Now, as you've heard, his solicitor, who saw him in his dying hours, says he actually doesn't believe that Brady knew where Keith Bennett's body was. But I think certainly surviving family members will continue to pursue people like the lawyer and people who did speak to Brady for any information that might help lead them to that site on Saddleworth Moor.
Becky, thank you. In the meantime, Ian Brady's body will not be released until assurances have been given that his ashes will not be scattered on Saddleworth Moor. That's from a senior coroner. The Moors murderer, Ian Brady, who died yesterday, has taken one final secret to the grave: the location of the body of his victim, Keith Bennett. Joining us from central London is Lord Tom Pendry, the former Labour MP who spent several hours with Ian Brady trying to get information about Keith Bennett's body. Hello to you, Lord Pendry. Thank you for joining us. We appreciate you taking the time. Do you think he knew where Keith Bennett was?
Sorry, I didn't get that.
Do you think he knew where Keith Bennett's body was buried on the moor?
He did say he knew, and I think he was determined to outshine his compatriot, who had found the body of Aslan Downey, and he wanted to show that he could actually find young Bennett's body. And of course, in the end, he didn't do that.
You spent a lot of time with him, hours and hours with him. His lawyer says he doesn't think he knew where the body was. You're saying that you think he did know where the body was?
No, what I'm saying is he believed he knew where it was when he spoke to me. However, I was doubtful about that because he seemed to be very vague. He was certainly ill. He had to have injections during the course of my long talk with him. And I'm not so sure he was stable enough to be able to be coherent and to know what he was saying, actually.
When you were with him, talk to us about him, what he was like, what his manner was like. Did he have any remorse for what he'd done?
He didn't show remorse at all. What he did show that he was someone who was quite determined to do the things he did. He actually said to me that he had also committed 2 other murders, and he was quite sober in a sense as to what he was saying, and I just felt that he was very ill and was deliberately being evasive at times with certain questions I was asking him about the actual place itself. He clearly wanted to show that he wanted to get up. He wanted to get up there into the moors, but he was very vague to me about the actual location. But he seemed to be sure in himself that he knew where to go.
Do you think, from having spoken to him and spent so much time with him, that he was potentially responsible for other murders as well?
I would believe he was, that he seemed at those points to be quite coherent about what he had done in the past. And yes, I do think he was capable of that. My whole object, of course, of being there was to try to ensure that young Bennett's body, young Bennett's, yes, his body was found, the burial place, but also to satisfy his mother that what I was doing was on her behalf, although I never told her. I didn't tell anyone of my visit to Brady because I didn't want to heighten her expectations. And that's the reason I was there. And of course, at the end, he wasn't able to fulfill what his whole attitude about where the body was buried.
What did he tell you about other murders that he had, he says, committed? And can you share that information with the police?
Yes, I think the police did know themselves, actually, but he did tell me one was in his home area of Scotland, and the other one was in Manchester itself.
And what else did he tell you?
Children.
What else did he tell you about that?
Well, he was just, in a way, kind of boast about it, I would think. It was out of line with what I was there to talk to him about.
But nevertheless, if he had said that there were murders that he had committed, you must have asked him more information. What else did he tell you about these murders? What else did he tell you about the people that he'd murdered?
Well, quite frankly, that wasn't part of why I was there. I was there for one reason, as I say, alone, and that was to see whether we can find out from him exactly where young boy Bennett was buried. That was my object. I wanted to do it for the young boy's parents, or mother in this case.
But with respect, my lord, if someone had said, I've committed several other murders, I'm guessing that you would have asked 1 or 2 follow-up questions.
No, I'd say I passed it on to the police, but I think they already knew about that. But that wasn't my objective of going there. I passed it on. I passed on the fact to the inspector in charge that he had agreed to go up to the moors, and I passed that on as well. But that was my mission, and that's what I fulfilled. What did not, of course, materialize is a successful visit by him to the moors.
Thank you for joining us on Sky News this afternoon. Thank you. The breaking news is that in the last few moments it's been announced that Ian Brady's body will not be released until there are assurances that his ashes won't be scattered on Saddleworth Moor. Nick Martin joining us from Manchester. Hello to you, Nick. What's that about?
Well, it's not quite clear, Kay, because, you know, it's a very brief report that we've got here, and it actually opens up a whole host of questions. The first one really is who they would be seeking assurances from, who will actually be turning up to claim the ashes of Ian Brady. Now, it's interesting just listening to that interview there, because Ian Brady didn't grant a lot of face-to-face interviews with people. Normally that was developed over a series of scores of letters. And in fact, we do know that he did form very close relationships with a certain number of people who used to visit him. And normally those relationships were formed if Ian Brady thought that there was a means to an end. Now, the big question now is why this coroner has felt the need to put this out to say Ian Brady's body will not be released until assurances have been given that the ashes will not be scattered on Saddleworth Moor. Well, who will have to give those assurances? Who will be the person who is actually claiming Ian Brady's ashes? And that is actually quite a big question, not least the insensitivities, of course, of having ashes scattered on Saddleworth Moor. I've not heard this suggestion before. It's completely out of the blue, and it does pose a lot of questions of the relationships which Ian Brady formed over the years. Is one or two of those relationships sufficiently close enough for that person to then be like a next of kin character who would then claim ashes, and for the coroner to need to say, well, hang on a minute, if you're going to claim those ashes, I need to have an assurance that they're not going to be scattered on Saddleworth Moor. Why would a reasonable person want to take the ashes of a child killer and scatter them in an area where he buried his murder victims? So there's a lot we can read into this, and it all piles into the mix of what's been said about Ian Brady today. A lot of people, of course, have been remembering the 5 victims and the families associated with them. But there is an undeniable story about what happens now. Is there a will? Are there any letters which have been spoken about over the years? And who is the person who is actually, if this is going to happen, claim the ashes? And why on earth is the coroner feeling the need to seek assurances from them that they're not going to be scattered on Saddleworth Moor, the crime scene itself?
Absolutely. Nick, for now, thank you. We don't know, do we? But we do know that we have a programme coming up for you shortly about Ian Brady. That to come in just a moment. Do stay tuned. Well, more on that now. Nick Martin has this special report on the Moors murderer, Ian Brady.
Between the summer of 1963 and the autumn of 1965, something terrible happened here that shocked the nation. It would come to forever define this stretch of moorland on the outskirts of Manchester as a place touched by evil. 5 children, all abducted, tortured and murdered. All but one of them buried here in the marshy peat bogs of Saddleworth Moor. Their killers, with their blank faces, would become instantly recognisable as the killer couple, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Brady's death to cancer at the age of 79 would bring this story to an end, if it wasn't for one big question. The body of Keith Bennett, their 3rd victim, has never been found, despite his mother begging him to reveal her son's resting place.
He knows where he is, and he's held it all these years, and I've had to suffer. He's got rights and I've not, and it's not fair on me.
And whilst Keith's body was still missing, he still had that focus of attention, and I think he enjoyed that, and it makes you wonder whether he just wanted to torture the family right to the very end.
He doesn't use the words, "I'm sorry." He says that those are meaningless words.
I have always been implacably opposed to capital punishment, but I would have made an exception in the cases of these two.
The morning after the death of Britain's most notorious criminal, and a single bouquet of fresh flowers is placed near to a shrine devoted to Keith Bennett on Saddleworth Moor. Keith was just 12 years old when he was abducted and murdered by Hindley and Brady. His body buried somewhere here, although it's never been found. I've covered the story of the Moors murders for 15 years. Only a handful of journalists to have written to and received letters from Ian Brady, in hope that we can begin to understand why he did what he did. But the truth is, he's much of a mystery in death, as he was in life.
Ian Brady now takes to his grave the truth about Keith Bennett's whereabouts. The serial killer had always hinted that he had not forgotten where he'd buried the little boy. It was a dark, murderous secret, and it has taunted the families of his victims ever since.
Keith Bennett's mother, Winnie, never gave up hope that she would one day find her son. In her last interview with me, she begged Brady to reveal Keith's final resting place.
Give me a chance to get my lad back before anything happens to me, because I want him buried before even Brady dies, to let him know that he's the one that's got the main key and he can give it me, or the police, or the press, and they can tell the police and go and search for him.
Winnie died in 2012, not knowing where her son was buried.
For the family to have closure would mean finding Keith and giving him a family burial, and that would at least give them some peace. They could never forget Keith, could never forgive Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, but at least that would give them some closure and they can get on with their lives. And whilst Keith's body was still missing and questions were being asked of him, he still had that focus of attention, and I think he enjoyed that, and it makes you wonder whether he just wanted to torture the family right to the very end. It was a level, it was just control and manipulation.
From a psychological perspective, Ian Brady had a personality disorder, and we would label the personality disorder that he had as psychopathy. He showed all the classic symptoms of somebody who was psychopathic. In other words, he was narcissistic, egoistic, he was very controlling, he was desperate for attention, he found it very difficult to show any empathy for the suffering of others.
Even as a child, Ian Brady was regarded as a secretive outsider, born in one of the roughest slums in Glasgow. He grew up with an interest in sadism, but after meeting Myra Hindley, that escalated.
Often what's motivating the killer couple is something that psychologists call a folie à deux, literally a madness shared by two, whereby each of the two partners convince each other in the beliefs that they have, goading each other on to go further and further in their warped thinking. Often in a killer couple, you will find that there's a dominant and a subservient. And for me, it was quite clear that Brady, this autodidactic who'd read Nietzsche and de Sade, was the dominant of the killer couple.
Their killing began with 16-year-old Pauline Reed, lured into Hindley's car and taken to the moor to meet Brady. Pauline was murdered and buried there. Next came 12-year-old John Kilbride, a clever young man, good at football. He loved to be with his 3 younger brothers.
He just didn't come home, John. I could see my mother getting worried then. Be round 5:30, 6 o'clock. He should have been home. He just didn't come home, and it got a bit later, and then she's out to the neighbours and then down at Ashton Market looking, and then all the neighbours are out looking, and then eventually it came to the police then, and everything escalated from there then.
John Kilbride had been lured into Myra Hindley's van and driven to the moor. His body would not be found for another 2 years. He'd been sexually assaulted and strangled.
I remember it very clear the night they turned up with John's shoe, the Winklepicker. I remember it well, that. And they heard the scream downstairs, and it was my dad, that. The scream, not my mum. My mum just, she was in like a daze. It was horrible. It was horrible, you know. And then my mother had to go down to hide, they had to go down to identify John. And it was just horrible to see my mum the way she was, to see her decline into such a state to what the person she was. You know, and she never came out of it, ever. Ever came out of that.
10-year-old Leslie Ann Downey's voice was recorded by Brady as she begged in vain for her life. When he and Hindley finally came to court, such details provoked an outrage scarcely witnessed before or since.
They were the first ones, really, to escape capital punishment. After the abolition of it in the mid-60s, theirs was the first trial after that where it wasn't available to the judge. I have always been implacably opposed to capital punishment, but I would have made an exception in the cases of these two.
More than 20 years after their conviction, Brady and Hindley were escorted back to Saddleworth Moor, where Pauline Reed's remains were found. In Ashworth Psychiatric Hospital on Merseyside, Brady spent many years on hunger strike, but being force-fed by staff. In 2013, he argued before a mental health tribunal that he wasn't mentally ill and should be allowed to starve himself to death. He failed in his bid. It was claimed that Ian Brady would one day reveal the location of Keith Bennett's body. Those who knew him well are sceptical.
I think so far as trying to locate Keith Bennett's body, whatever he knew about the situation and the possible location would have been sorted out in the 1980s. I do feel very, very sorry for the family, and indeed I've had situations where I've been on the other side in a similar situation to relatives of victims whose bodies haven't been found, and the anguish is considerable, but that doesn't mean that in this particular case he had the answer.
He seemed to imply that he would know, for example, where the body of Keith Bennett was buried, but we have no real evidence that by the stage that he was engaging in those kinds of statements that he truly did know where he had buried Keith's body. But again, this formed part of his narcissistic personality disorder, whereby he craved attention, and by implying that he knew where Keith's body was, he got that attention.
It is the end of a dark chapter in British criminal history. There is still hope that somewhere in this remote place lies the body of Keith Bennett, and that one day he will be found. Nick Martin, Sky News.